For centuries, the story of Lilith has lingered like a shadow at the edge of sacred history, half whispered in ancient manuscripts, erased from official scripture, yet endlessly resurfacing in moments when humanity begins questioning the structures that define its faith. The Bible mentions her only once in a single cryptic verse, buried inside a prophecy of desolation, and then nothing. Silence. Revision. Removal. But silence itself is a sign. Whenever a figure is erased this thoroughly, this aggressively, it tells us that the story was never harmless to begin with. Tonight, as we open the pages that were never meant to be opened, we enter a world where Lilith is not a demon lurking in the night, not a seductress from folklore, but a forbidden symbol, one tied to ancient prophecies, cosmic rebellion, and a version of humanity's origin story that was too dangerous for the early writers of scripture to preserve. To understand Lilith is to understand the part of biblical history that lives in the margins, the fragments, the mistranslations. It is to examine what the prophets wrote, what the priests removed, and what the scribes tried to bury beneath layers of theology and fear. Most people know the sanitized version. Adam was alone, God created Eve, and humanity began. But the older stories, the ones recorded by Jewish mystics preserved in forgotten tablets, echoed in surrounding civilizations, tell a much stranger beginning. They claim that before Eve ever opened her eyes, another woman stood beside Adam, a woman who refused to submit, a woman who walked away from Eden rather than bow to any hierarchy. Her name was Lilith, and her departure became the earliest act of defiance in human myth. But beneath the folklore lies something deeper. Lilith was not condemned simply for rebellion. She was erased because she disrupted the narrative that religious systems needed to maintain order. And it was not her story alone that threatened them. It was what her story prophesied. Because hidden behind the demonized image is a far older archetype, the dark feminine force that emerges whenever civilization collapses, whenever spiritual imbalance grows too large, whenever the feminine is suppressed long enough to turn into shadow. So the question is not, who was Lilith? The real question, the forbidden question, is this: what prophecy did she carry that made the biblical author so determined to hide her? What vision of humanity's future was encoded in the single verse that dared to mention her name? And more importantly, why is that prophecy resurfacing now, long before her name was whispered in the corridors of medieval mysticism or demonized in later theological traditions? Lilith lived in far older myths, myths carved into clay, sung in temples, and feared by civilizations that predated Israel by thousands of years. To understand the forbidden prophecy attached to her, we must begin not with the Bible, but with the cracked tablets of Mesopotamia, where she appears not as a temptress or a demon, but as a primordial force woven into the fabric of the cosmos. In Sumerian lore, she is Lilitu, a being tied to the desert winds, the wild places, the boundary between the living and the dead. She was not created to frighten children. She was the personification of the unknown itself. The night before firelight existed, the storm before order took hold. These early cultures did not see Lilith as evil. They saw her as necessary, the embodiment of the raw feminine chaos that balanced the masculine order of kings and gods. She was the untamed half of creation, the part that could not be domesticated. And because she could not be controlled, she was respected and feared in equal measure. As Mesopotamian culture evolved, Lilith's image shifted with it. In Akkadian hymns and Babylonian incantations, she appears as a liminal being who dwells at the edges of civilization, watching the rise and fall of empires. She was a guardian of threshold's birth, death wilderness storm, and those thresholds were considered sacred. Everything ancient people could not predict or explain was placed under her domain, not because she caused chaos, but because she belonged to it. The idea that Lilith was malevolent came later mostly from the hands of priests who sought to centralize spiritual authority by restricting which divine forces could be worshipped or honored. For the Sumerians, however, Lilith represented a feminine power too fundamental to erase the fierce independence of nature, the sovereignty of the feminine spirit, the creative destructive rhythm that all life depends on. But as patriarchal systems rose in the Near East, old goddesses, and especially dark feminine figures, became politically inconvenient. Divine feminine autonomy was incompatible with the new religious models built on hierarchy, obedience, and centralized control. So Lilith began the slow transformation from sacred archetype to demonized outcast. Her associations with Inanna Ishtar, the great goddess of love, war sovereignty, and cosmic descent, were deliberately severed. Her attributes were distorted, twisted, and weaponized against her. Where she once symbolized unclaimed power, she was rewritten as a thief of children. Where she once represented freedom, she was turned into a seducer of men. Where she once guarded the thresholds of life and death, she was recast as a predator of the night. These shifts reveal less about Lilith and more about the anxieties of the cultures that rewrote her. The fear of independent femininity, the fear of uncontrolled desire, the fear of a cosmic order not dominated by male gods. Yet even in the midst of erasure, something survived. The older stories left faint fingerprints, clues that Lilith was never meant to be contained within the box later religion forced around her. She appears in spells, amulets, and ritual objects across the ancient Near East, always in liminal spaces, always connected to transitions, storms, sexuality transformation, and untamed freedom. This is the Lilith that predates the Bible, a cosmic force older than Eden, older than Adam, older even than the theologies that tried to silence her. And it is precisely this older version of Lilith, the one tied to nature, death, desire, and sovereignty, that becomes essential when we begin unraveling the forbidden prophecy associated with her name. Because the prophecy does not emerge from the demonized caricature created later, but from the ancient primordial figure who represented the feminine shadow of creation itself. If the ancient world painted Lilith as a primordial force, the Bible reduced her to a single, enigmatic word that translators spent centuries running from. That word appears in Isaiah 34, chapter 14, a passage drenched in apocalyptic imagery, describing the total collapse of Edom under divine judgment. The land is reduced to a haunted wasteland, a realm where abandoned kingdoms and broken empires rot beneath the sun. Amid this desolation, the Hebrew text states that Lilith will find a place of rest. But instead of leaving her name intact, most translations bury it under euphemisms: night creature, night demon, screech owl, female monster. Anything but Lilith herself. Why? Because acknowledging her presence forces the reader to accept that the biblical authors knew exactly who she was, a figure tied to chaos, wilderness, divine judgment, and a feminine power older than their theology allowed. Isaiah is not describing a random animal or a mythical beast. He is invoking a symbol understood by his audience, a symbol of the shadow feminine rising in the ruins of fallen nations. And yet, through centuries of translation, the scribes and church fathers scrubbed her name away, fearful of what it might imply about the boundaries of their own scripture. To grasp why this matters, we must understand the context of Isaiah's prophecy. Chapter 34 is not merely a poetic curse. It is a prophetic image of cosmic reversal, where the structures of power are dismantled and the wilderness reclaims civilization. In this landscape of judgment, every creature listed has symbolic meaning. Hyenas representing scavengers of empire, satyrs representing pagan authority, serpents representing desolation. But only one figure stands out: Lilith. She is not placed among the carrion animals. She is given rest. This is a theological earthquake. Isaiah, a prophet deeply concerned with divine order, uses Lilith to signify a return of feminine chaos in the aftermath of judgment. It suggests that when human systems collapse, when prideful nations fall, when corrupt kings crumble the forces they tried to suppress, rise again. Lilith becomes not a monster, but a sign. A marker that civilization's collapse is complete, that the wilderness has swallowed the works of men, and that hidden forces may return to the world stage. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, sidestepped this implication entirely. Instead of writing Lilith, they inserted Onokantaros, a mythical donkey-centaur hybrid. The Vulgate chose Lamia, a classical demon known for devouring children. Later English Bibles softened it further: night bird owl, night creature. Each translation drifts further from the original, as though multiple generations of scholars agreed silently that Lilith must never appear in the sacred canon. This systematic avoidance speaks volumes. It reveals not only a discomfort with her mythology, but also a fear that her presence in Scripture could validate the very traditions the Church fought to suppress, traditions tied to goddesses' feminine power and cosmic duality. Even the Dead Sea Scrolls preserve fragments that hint at her role in apocalyptic imagery. In the Qumran texts, Lilith is associated with desert spirits and end-time battles lingering at the edges of divine confrontation. These writings do not depict her as a temptress, but as a harbinger of a spiritual threshold, a force that emerges when order collapses and humanity faces the consequences of its corruption. When we place Isaiah 34:14 alongside these texts, a startling pattern emerges. Lilith is not a demon haunting the margins of Scripture. She is a prophetic symbol, intentionally obscured a name, whose survival threatened theological control. And it is this obscured symbol, this forbidden presence in Isaiah, that becomes the key to unlocking the prophecy surrounding her return. When scholars speak of Lilith today, they often reduce her to folklore, a demon of the night, a seductress, a shadow in rabbinic commentary. But buried beneath these later distortions lies something far more unsettling, a pattern of ancient prophecies and esoteric interpretations that link Lilith not to humanity's past, but to its end. For early mystics, Lilith was never just Adam's rival or an inconvenient symbol of feminine rebellion. She was a harbinger of cosmic transition, a sign of the world tipping back into primordial chaos before rebirth. And the more one examines the texts and fragments surrounding her, the more it becomes clear that Lilith's presence is woven through the apocalyptic imagination in ways that theologians deliberately downplayed or erased. In the forbidden prophecy, one whispered in mystical sects encoded in desert scrolls and hinted at. In Isaiah's wasteland vision, Lilith emerges as an omen of the final cycle, a return of the dark feminine force that precedes the collapse of corrupted systems and the judging of nations. To understand why ancient writers associated Lilith with the end times, we must revisit the three motifs embedded in the prophecy fragments. The first motif is the return of the feminine chaos. In Mesopotamian cosmology, creation began not with order, but with swirling, untamed waters, a womb of chaos embodied by goddesses like Tiamat. Lilith, who inherited echoes of this primordial role, represented the feminine power that civilization attempted to suppress: unpredictability, independence, sovereignty, nature unbound. In apocalyptic symbolism, her return indicates that the world has grown so rigid, so unnatural, so patriarchally imbalanced, that it must collapse back into chaos before it can be renewed. This is not destruction for its own sake. It is cosmic correction. When prophets described the wilderness reclaiming empires, the desert swallowing cities, and the night consuming the light, they were invoking the rebalancing power of the forgotten feminine. Lilith's resting place in Isaiah is not peaceful. It is a throne in the ruins. The second motif is judgment through shadow. While many apocalyptic figures judge through fire, war, or divine wrath, Lilith's judgment is psychological and spiritual. She reveals what humanity suppresses: the shadow self that remains hidden beneath moral veneers. In mystical interpretations, the end times are not a cosmic explosion, but a mass unveiling of truth. Lilith becomes the embodiment of that unveiling. She exposes hypocrisy, challenges false purity, and forces civilizations to face the darkness they have projected onto the feminine for millennia. In this prophecy, her presence signals a reckoning, not with monsters or beasts, but with the parts of humanity it refuses to acknowledge. The shadow once denied rises to consume the structures that denied it. This is why early religious authorities feared her. Lilith's prophecy does not destroy humanity. It unmasks it. The third motif is the desert throne prophecy, one of the most suppressed interpretations found in esoteric commentary. It describes a time when the world's spiritual energy dries up, when temples become empty, rituals, when leaders become corrupt, when truth is distorted by power. In this barren age, the prophecy states that the Queen of the Threshold, a title associated with Lilith in pre-biblical lore, will sit upon a throne formed from the ruins of fallen kingdoms. The desert throne is not literal. It is symbolic of a world where false structures have collapsed, leaving only raw truth behind. Lilith's enthronement represents the world's return to its elemental state before renewal. Unlike other apocalyptic figures who command armies or wield fire, Lilith rules over silence, exposure, and the stripping away of illusion. Her prophecy is terrifying because it describes not an external enemy, but an internal reckoning. When these motifs are compared with the imagery of Revelation, an eerie resonance appears. The woman in the wilderness clothed with the sun, yet pursued by the dragon, mirrors the ancient archetype of the empowered feminine, exiled to the margins, Babylon the Great. The scarlet-robed woman sitting over collapsing empires reflects the collective shadow of suppressed femininity, turned monstrous by patriarchal fear. Even the beast rising from the sea echoes the return of chaos before renewal. Though Revelation never mentions Lilith by name, the architecture of its symbolism aligns with the forbidden prophecy. A feminine force cast out, demonized, or controlled returns during the world's unraveling to balance the scales. This is the Lilith of the apocalypse, not a creature of the night, but a cosmic archetype, signaling the collapse of false orders and the unveiling of truth. The forbidden prophecy was not hidden because it was dangerous to faith, but because it was dangerous to institutions. Lilith's return is not about destruction. It is about exposure, not about vengeance, but about balance. Not about the end of the world, but the end of the world as it has been allowed to exist. To uncover the full weight of the forbidden prophecy, we must examine the conflict that has silently shaped spiritual imagination for thousands of years, the unspoken war between Lilith and Eve. This is not merely a tale of two women. It is the clash between two archetypes, two visions of humanity, two possible destinies for the human soul. In early Jewish mysticism, Lilith was described as Adam's first companion, created from the same earth, the same dust, the same divine breath. She was his equal in every way, neither above nor below him. But equality was the very thing that disrupted the fragile order of Eden. Lilith refused to accept a hierarchy that placed her beneath Adam. And when she spoke the secret name of God, she left the garden forever. This act of departure was not a rebellion against divinity, but a rejection of domination. Meanwhile, Eve was shaped not from the earth, but from Adam's rib, a symbol interpreted by later theologians to represent unity, but understood by ancient mystics as a sign of subordination. She embodied harmony. Obedience, the image of a woman created to assist rather than to stand beside. The two together form a cosmic contrast. Lilith, the unbound force of self-sovereignty. Eve, the cultivated ideal of ordered femininity. But the real conflict begins after Eden. Lilith becomes the archetype of the exiled feminine, the part of humanity that refuses control, refuses silence, refuses to be defined by any authority but its own. Eve becomes the archetype of the accepted feminine, gentle, compliant, fruitful, the safe version of womanhood endorsed by patriarchal religion. These two forces are not just mythological. They exist within every person. Lilith is the shadow we are told to fear. Desire, autonomy, intuition, wild creativity. Eve is the light. We are taught to emulate purity, caretaking, obedience, innocence. When ancient writers demonized Lilith, they were symbolically demonizing the parts of human nature that threatened social order. When they elevated Eve, they were elevating compliance as virtue. But the hidden war between these archetypes is more than psychological. In prophetic traditions, it represents two competing outcomes for humanity's future. A world aligned with Eve remains orderly, but stagnant, controlled, but spiritually muted. A world aligned with Lilith becomes chaotic, but honest, unbound, but dangerously free. And according to esoteric traditions, the apocalypse arrives when the imbalance between these archetypes becomes too great. In the Kabbalistic texts, Lilith is linked to the Sitra Achra, the other side, the realm of shadows where suppressed energies gather strength. Eve, meanwhile, symbolizes the Kedusha, the realm of sacred order. These two domains are not enemies by nature, but when one is repressed, the other becomes distorted. The more societies idealized Eve's submissive purity, the more Lilith's shadow grew in the collective unconscious. Myths portray Lilith as stealing children or seducing men, not because she was inherently evil, but because patriarchal interpreters projected their deepest fears onto her. The fear that women could possess power without permission, sexuality without shame, knowledge without supervision. This projection fed the shadow that Lilith came to represent. And in prophetic symbolism, the return of Lilith signifies the moment when the shadow can no longer be denied. It is a warning that humanity cannot progress, while half of its nature remains imprisoned. Thus, the war between Lilith and Eve is not a battle for dominance, but a struggle for wholeness. Humanity fractured itself by elevating one archetype and burying the other. And the prophecy suggests that the end times crisis will involve confronting this fracture. Lilith returns not to overthrow Eve, but to reclaim the half of the human soul that was cast into darkness. And until both archetypes stand side by side, equal, integrated, reconciled, the world remains spiritually incomplete. If the early biblical writers carefully erased Lilith from Scripture, the medieval church went even further. They turned her into a monster. And this transformation was not accidental, not a misreading, not a cultural misunderstanding. It was strategic. Because Lilith represented everything the rising religious authorities could not control: female sexuality, spiritual autonomy, knowledge outside priestly authority, and the ancient memory of goddesses who once ruled land, sky, and underworld. In a world where religious power depended on hierarchy, obedience, and the suppression of older pagan traditions, Lilith was a threat too potent to allow. She embodied the divine feminine that patriarchal systems worked tirelessly to extinguish, the half of the sacred that was wild, intuitive, cyclical, lunar, and uncontrollable. So the church rebranded her. They crafted a new Lilith, a child-stealing demon, a succubus who preyed upon sleeping men, a corrupter of purity. But these fantasies reveal far more about the anxieties of the church than about Lilith herself. The image of a woman who seduces men in the night was a projection of clerical fear, a fear of desire, of the body, of the feminine mysteries they could not fully purge from their congregations. And the myth of Lilith harming infants was a symbolic attack on women's generative power, an attempt to frame feminine independence as a threat to family lineage and social order. To further suppress her religious authorities, linked Lilith to witchcraft, positioning her as the primordial witch from whom all others descended. Any woman who practiced healing, midwifery, herbal knowledge, or ritual traditions outside the church's sanction was painted as one of Lilith's daughters, dangerous, seductive, spiritually unclean. This tactic effectively weaponized Lilith against women themselves, turning a once sacred archetype into a warning sign. Yet beneath this demonization lies something more revealing. The church feared Lilith because she preserved the memory of the divine feminine, theologically erased from Christianity. While male gods dominated the Abrahamic pantheon, older cultures had venerated goddesses of wisdom, fertility, death, and cosmic order. Inanna Ishtar, Astarte, Asherah, Anahita. These figures, powerful and autonomous, lived on in cultural memory, and Lilith, who carried traces of these deities in her ancient origins, became the symbol onto which the church projected its mission to eradicate goddess worship. By demonizing her, they believed they were eliminating the last doorway through which the feminine divine could re-enter spiritual consciousness. But suppressing a symbol does not destroy it. It drives it into the collective shadow, where it grows in potency. Over centuries, Lilith became the embodiment of everything the church denied: the sensual body, the intuitive mind, the lunar cycle, the pre-Christian mysteries, the power of creation and destruction held within the feminine, even as her name was invoked to instill fear. The archetype behind her continued to gather strength in secrecy. She survived in amulets, in whispered stories, in women's rituals, passed down through generations. And paradoxically, the more she was vilified, the more she solidified her role as the shadow of the divine feminine, the part of the sacred that patriarchal religion attempted to exile, but could never fully eradicate. In prophecy, the return of Lilith is not the return of a demon. It is the return of the suppressed, sacred feminine in its shadow form. This is why religious institutions feared her so deeply. Recognizing Lilith meant acknowledging everything they had removed from the spiritual narrative. Female agency, sacred sexuality, the creative darkness before light, the cyclical nature of death and rebirth, and the balance that once defined ancient cosmology. Lilith's resurgence signals the unraveling of systems built on imbalance. It marks the moment when the divine that was cast into shadow rises to reclaim its place in the world's spiritual story. For thousands of years, Lilith lived in the footnotes of forbidden texts and scattered myths, in the margins of scripture. But in the 21st century, something unprecedented has happened. She has returned not as a demon or a mythological curiosity, but as a cultural, psychological, and spiritual force rising across the modern world. Her resurgence is not accidental. It mirrors a global shift, an unraveling of old structures, a collapse of the institutions that defined morality, identity power, and spiritual authority for centuries. When ancient prophets described a feminine force rising in the wilderness at the end of ages, they were not predicting a literal figure stepping into history. They were describing a collective awakening of the suppressed shadow within humanity. And today, Lilith reappears everywhere, in astrology charts, in psychological frameworks, in feminist discourse, in spiritual communities, reclaiming the divine feminine in the mass questioning of patriarchal systems, and even in mainstream media, where the archetype of the dark, self-sovereign woman has become a symbol of transformation. The world is not summoning Lilith. Rather, society has become fertile ground for the archetype she represents to reawaken. One of the clearest signs of this return is found in modern psychology, particularly in Jungian thought. Carl Jung wrote that the apocalypse is not an external destruction, but an internal confrontation with the collective shadow, the parts of humanity that have been denied, feared, or repressed. Lilith is the feminine shadow personified. She represents instinct, intuition, sexuality, rage, grief, independence, and all the primal energies that organized religion and patriarchal culture tried to suppress. Jung warned that whenever a society represses an essential part of human nature, that force eventually erupts with explosive power. This eruption is what he described as psychic compensation, the psyche restoring balance. And today, that compensation is visible everywhere, in the rise of movements empowering women, in the rejection of oppressive institutions, in the global hunger for spiritual authenticity, and in the widespread rediscovery of esoteric traditions. Lilith's return is psychological prophecy fulfilled. The shadow insists on being seen. On a societal and prophetic scale, the return of Lilith corresponds to what many mystics call the Shadow Age, a time when illusions collapse, secrets surface, and collective denial breaks apart. We are living in a moment where corruption is exposed faster than ever, where the failures of governments, churches, and systems of authority are no longer hidden behind sacred veneers. Ancient prophecy described a time when the wilderness would reclaim civilization not physically, but spiritually. The wild, untamed feminine, returning to strip away deception and reveal the truth beneath. That wilderness is symbolic of Lilith's domain. She is not the destroyer of order. She is the force that reveals when order has become corruption. The chaos we see in politics, religion, and collective identity is not random. It is the shadow rising, demanding recognition. Astrology amplifies this theme. In modern natal charts, the black moon Lilith point represents the primal, unfiltered truth of the soul. The place where a person refuses to be controlled, refuses to conform, refuses to betray themselves. The global obsession with Lilith placements is not about superstition. It is an attempt to understand why so many people feel the inner tension between who they were taught to be and who they truly are. In a symbolic sense, humanity is experiencing its own Lilith transit, a collective awakening of autonomy, intuition, and the refusal to be spiritually silenced. On a spiritual level, the return of Lilith coincides with a global rebalancing of masculine and feminine energies, For centuries, societies elevated the masculine principles of structure, logic, control, and outward power while suppressing the feminine principles of intuition, emotional depth, cyclical renewal, and inner knowing. But imbalance cannot last forever. Prophecy suggests that before renewal can come, the suppressed force must rise in its shadow form first. This is why Lilith returns as the dark feminine. Not because darkness is her essence, but because shadow is the only language humanity left her after centuries of suppression. If the divine feminine had not been exiled, Lilith would not need to return as its shadow. This is the message embedded in the forbidden prophecy. Lilith's return marks not the end of the world, but the end of false worlds, the end of illusions, the end of systems that survived by silencing half of the human soul. She rises in a time of upheaval, because upheaval is the only time humanity is willing to confront its own shadow. And until humanity integrates the part of itself that Lilith represents, its wildness, its intuition, its spiritual autonomy, it will remain trapped in cycles of collapse and rebirth. Her return is not a threat. It is an invitation. As we reach the end of this journey, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The forbidden prophecy of Lilith was never merely a myth about a woman exiled from Eden or a demon whispered about in medieval fear. It was a mirror one held up to humanity across thousands of years, waiting for the moment when we would dare to look into it. Lilith's story survives not because she was a monster, but because she represents the part of the human spirit that institutions, empires, and religions have always tried to suppress. She is the voice that refuses silence, the truth that refuses burial, the shadow that refuses to disappear simply because someone rewrites the narrative. And as the world enters a new era of upheaval, political, spiritual, psychological, or archetype emerges again, reminding us that the greatest danger is not darkness, but the denial of it. The prophecy of Lilith does not predict destruction. It predicts confrontation, the moment when humanity must face the parts of itself it tried to exile, just as Adam and Eden tried to exile her. For centuries, we were told to fear Lilith because fear is easier to control than understanding. But if you strip away the demon masks and the twisted legends, what remains is a symbol of sovereignty, intuition, elemental truth, qualities that threaten rigid systems but liberate the human soul. Her return in modern consciousness is not supernatural. It is psychological, cultural, and spiritual. It signals that the world has grown tired of one-sided stories. Stories where obedience is virtue, where shadow is evil, where autonomy is sin. The prophecy warned that when imbalance becomes unbearable, the feminine shadow would rise not to destroy humanity, but to restore the balance humanity abandoned. And today, we are witnessing exactly that: people confronting their inner darkness, questioning inherited beliefs, reclaiming sacred feminine wisdom, and dismantling systems built on suppression. So what does the prophecy demand of us now? Not worship, not fear, but honesty. Lilith asks a question older than Scripture. What truth are you still running from? Because the apocalypse is not a fire that consumes the world. It is a light that reveals it. And the moment we stop demonizing the parts of ourselves that do not fit the narrative, the moment we integrate the shadow instead of exiling it, the prophecy ends. Lilith's return was never the threat. Our refusal to face her was. The real redemption, the real transformation begins the moment we accept that the story of Lilith was never about the darkness outside us, but the darkness within us, waiting to be understood.